"Turn off the mic if she cries." A man's voice echoed from the back of the auditorium, followed by a ripple of laughter that spread faster than anyone cared to stop. And under the harsh white glow of the stage lights, Sophie Brooks stood alone, small hands trembling at her sides, her worn shoes barely gripping the polished wood floor, her dress just a little too faded for an event meant to celebrate talent. While in the last row, her father, Ethan Brooks, sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, but heavy, eyes locked on his daughter with a quiet intensity that carried years of loss, of promises made in whispers to someone no longer there. And the room buzzed with that familiar cruelty people disguise as humor. A few teenagers leaned toward each other with smirks. A woman crossed her arms and sighed. A teacher checked her clipboard like this was already a mistake that needed to end quickly. And the microphone gave a faint feedback hum as Sophie stepped closer, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning the crowd, but never quite landing anywhere safe. And Ethan's fingers curled against his knees, as if holding himself in place required strength no one else could see. Because he had told himself she wasn't ready. Because he had promised he would protect her from moments exactly like this. And yet here she was, standing in front of a room that had already decided who she was before she even made a sound. And the MC offered a polite but distant smile. "Whenever you're ready," he said, though his tone carried the weight of low expectations, and Sophie nodded. Barely, her lips parting but no sound coming out, and the silence stretched. 5 seconds, then 7, long enough for the whispers to return, for a boy near the front to chuckle, for someone else to mutter, "This is painful." And Ethan felt something inside him tighten, a quiet war between stepping in and staying seated, between fear and faith, because somewhere deep in his memory lived a voice, soft and steady, telling him to let her find her own strength, even if it broke his heart to watch. And the air in the room shifted just slightly as Sophie closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in something closer to remembering. Like she was reaching for a place no one else in that room had ever been. And then it happened. Not a song, not a performance, just one single note, pure and steady, rising into the space like it had always belonged there. And the laughter stopped mid-breath. The whispers dissolved into nothing. Even the faint hum of the lights seemed to fade. And Ethan's chest tightened as recognition hit him like a quiet storm, because that note wasn't random. It wasn't practiced for applause. It was the exact opening note of a song that had never been played outside the walls of their home. A song written in softer days, in a life that ended too soon. And in that moment, the room didn't just go silent. It listened, truly listened, as if something deeper than talent had just been awakened. And no one moved. No one dared to interrupt what was beginning to unfold. The note did not fade. It held, steady and fragile, yet impossibly sure. And Sophie did not open her eyes as if she trusted something deeper than the room in front of her. While the audience sat frozen, the same people who had laughed now leaning forward without realizing it. Their expressions shifting from amusement to something quieter, something uncertain, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his chest as memories rose uninvited. A dim kitchen lit by a single warm bulb, a piano slightly out of tune, a woman's soft voice guiding a younger Sophie through that exact note again and again with patience and grace, telling her that the first note was not about perfection but about truth. And now here it was, carried into a room that had not earned it, and the silence stretched, not empty but full, like the pause before rain. And then Sophie took a breath, small but certain, and followed that note with another, her voice unfolding carefully, not loud, not trying to impress, but honest in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And a girl in the second row lowered her phone. A teacher who had been ready to cut the performance short slowly lifted her head. And somewhere near the back, the man who had made the joke shifted in his seat, his smile gone, replaced by something he could not quite name. And Ethan did not move. He did not clap. He did not even blink. Because he knew this was not a performance. This was something being returned, something that had been lost, and was now finding its way back through his daughter's voice. And Sophie's hands stopped trembling, her shoulders easing as if the music itself was holding her up, and she opened her eyes just enough to see the outline of the room, no longer a blur of judgment, but a space that was listening, truly listening. And her voice grew, not in volume, but in confidence, each word carrying a softness that settled into the corners of the auditorium. reaching people who had come only to watch and leaving them unexpectedly still. And Ethan felt the weight he had carried for years begin to shift, not disappear, but change, like a door opening just enough to let light through. And he realized that this was the moment he had been afraid of and hoping for at the same time. The moment where she would either break or become something stronger than the silence that had once taken her voice away. And as Sophie reached the end of the first line, her voice did not falter, it steadied, and the room, once filled with noise, now held its breath as if everyone understood that whatever came next would not just be heard, it would be felt. The second line did not rush forward. It arrived with quiet certainty, and Sophie's voice carried a warmth that did not belong to a child trying to impress, but to someone remembering something precious, something carefully held, and the audience felt it even if they could not explain it, their posture softening, their eyes no longer searching for flaws but drawn into the space she was creating, and Ethan's gaze never left her, his mind moving through years that had shaped this moment, long nights when the house felt too quiet, when music had stopped completely because it hurt too much to continue, when Sophie would sit near the old piano but never touch it, her small fingers resting on the keys without pressing down, as if sound itself had become something fragile, something dangerous, and he had let it be, because forcing it would have broken something deeper, and now, standing under those bright lights, she was not just singing. She was choosing to step into a space she had once left behind. And that choice carried more strength than anyone in that room could understand. And the woman in the front row who had been whispering earlier slowly placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes beginning to glisten, while a boy who had laughed now stared at the stage, confused by the sudden weight in his chest, unsure why it felt harder to breathe. And Sophie continued, her voice steady, each word landing with gentle precision, not loud enough to demand attention but true enough to hold it. And the microphone no longer hummed awkwardly. It simply carried her sound into every corner, and even the smallest movements in the room seemed to quiet themselves. A chair that had been shifting stilled, a program booklet stopped rustling, and the teacher who had been ready to end the performance lowered her clipboard entirely. Her expression softened into something close to respect, and Ethan felt a tear escape. Before he could stop it, not from sadness but from recognition. Because this was not the voice he remembered from the past. This was something new, something shaped by loss but not defined by it, something that carried both memory and courage in the same breath. And he realized that Sophie was not singing to the audience. She was singing through them, past them, into a place that existed between who she had been and who she was becoming. And the room felt it, the shift from watching to witnessing, from judging to understanding. And as Sophie reached the next phrase, her voice lifted just slightly, not louder but fuller, and it settled over the audience like a quiet promise. And in that moment, no one thought about her clothes, no one thought about her background, no one remembered the laughter from minutes before, because something deeper had taken hold, something that did not need explanation, only presence. And the silence that followed each line was no longer empty, it was filled with something almost sacred, as if every person in that room was being asked, without words, to listen more carefully than they ever had before. The melody did not rush toward an ending, it unfolded. Slowly, like something that had waited a long time to be heard, and Sophie stood there no longer as a child seeking approval, but as someone carrying a story too honest to hide, her voice weaving through the quiet air with a calm strength that seemed to steady even herself. And the audience leaned in without realizing it, drawn by something they could feel but not fully explain, while Ethan sat motionless, his hands now relaxed against his knees, his eyes reflecting a mixture of disbelief and quiet pride, because the fear he had carried for so long, the fear that the world would break her the way it had once silenced her, was slowly dissolving in front of him, replaced by something stronger, something built not from protection but from trust. And near the center row, a teacher who had once written Sophie off as withdrawn lowered her gaze, as if rethinking every moment she had misunderstood, while a group of students who had whispered earlier now sat still, their attention fixed. Their expressions softened into something closer to humility, and the room itself seemed to breathe differently. The earlier tension replaced by a shared stillness that connected strangers in a way that felt almost sacred, and Sophie's voice carried into that stillness with gentle certainty, each phrase landing with quiet precision, not trying to impress, not trying to compete, but simply offering something real, and in that offering, the entire room shifted, because authenticity does not need volume. It needs truth, and that truth was undeniable, and Ethan felt another memory rise, not of loss this time, but of laughter, of his wife sitting at the piano, smiling as she told Sophie that music was never about being the best in the room. It was about being the most honest, and now, watching his daughter stand in that honesty, he understood what she had meant all along, and Sophie took a small breath between lines, her shoulders lifting slightly before settling again, and in that pause, no one moved, no one dared to interrupt the fragile beauty of the moment, because something had changed in all of them, something quiet and lasting. And as she moved into the next part of the song, her voice grew just enough to fill the space with a soft confidence, not overpowering but undeniable, and a woman in the back wiped her eyes without realizing it, while a man who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably, not from shame alone, but from the realization that he had almost missed something important, something meaningful, and the silence that followed each note was no longer empty. It was filled with respect, with reflection, with a shared understanding that what they were witnessing was not just talent but courage, the kind that does not announce itself but reveals itself in moments like this. And Ethan felt his chest rise and fall more steadily now, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet sense of peace, because for the first time in a long time, he was not worried about what would happen next. He was simply present, watching his daughter become exactly who she was meant to be, one note at a time. The final lines did not rush toward applause. They settled gently into the room, and Sophie held the last note just long enough for it to become something more than sound, something that lingered in the air like a quiet truth no one wanted to disturb. And when her voice finally softened into silence, it was not the end people expected. It was a moment suspended between breath and understanding, and no one moved, not a chair, not a hand, not even a whisper, because the room had forgotten how to react, and Ethan felt that stillness as deeply as the music itself, his eyes fixed on his daughter as if trying to memorize every second, every detail, the way her shoulders slowly lowered, the way her hands no longer trembled, the way she stood there not waiting for approval, but simply existing in the moment she had created. And somewhere near the front, a man who had laughed earlier lowered his head, his expression no longer careless but thoughtful, as if he had just been reminded of something he had long ignored. And a teacher who had once doubted Sophie felt a quiet shift inside her, a recognition that she had misunderstood not just a student but a story she had never taken the time to hear. And the silence stretched, not uncomfortable but full, rich with meaning, until finally, one person began to clap, slow and uncertain at first, then another, and another, until the sound built into something genuine, something earned, not loud in its beginning but powerful in its honesty. And Sophie blinked as if returning from somewhere far away, her eyes scanning the audience not with fear this time, but with a quiet curiosity, as if she was seeing them clearly for the first time. And Ethan stood slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention, just rising with a calm dignity that matched the moment. And though he did not say a word, the pride in his eyes spoke louder than any applause, because he understood something now that he had not fully grasped before, that protecting her had never been about shielding her from the world. It had been about giving her the space to face it in her own way. And Sophie took a small step back from the microphone, her breath steady, her posture relaxed, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded again, replaced by a softer silence, one that held respect instead of doubt. And as she turned slightly toward the side of the stage, her eyes found Ethan, and in that glance, there was no need for words, only a shared understanding that something had changed, something quiet but lasting. And the audience continued to clap, some standing now, some wiping their eyes, all of them aware in their own way that they had witnessed more than a performance. They had witnessed a transformation, and yet, as the applause filled the room, there was still a feeling lingering beneath it all, a sense that this moment, as powerful as it was only the beginning of a story that had much more left to unfold. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered with a warmth that felt unfamiliar in that room. and Sophie stepped off the stage slowly, her movements careful, as if she was still holding on to something delicate inside her, while the lights above seemed less harsh now, softer somehow, and the hallway behind the stage greeted her with a quieter kind of stillness, the kind that allowed a person to breathe again, and Ethan moved toward her without rushing, his steps steady, his expression calm but filled with something deeper than pride, something closer to quiet relief. And for a moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other, neither speaking, because some moments do not need words, they need presence. And Sophie gave a small, almost shy smile, the kind that carried both courage and vulnerability, and Ethan nodded gently, as if to say that he had seen everything, every note, every breath, every ounce of strength it took for her to stand there and be heard. And the muffled sound of applause still echoed, faintly from the auditorium, a reminder of what had just happened, but neither of them turned back, because the most important part of that moment had already passed between them. And as they began to walk down the narrow hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting long shadows along the floor, and Sophie's steps grew lighter, her shoulders no longer tight, her hands no longer clenched, and Ethan noticed it. The way she carried herself differently, not taller, not louder, but steadier, like someone who had found something she did not know she had lost. And behind them, a few voices began to rise, teachers calling out her name, students whispering in a tone that was no longer mocking but curious, even respectful. And one of the teachers who had doubted her stepped forward, her voice softer now, asking if Sophie would consider performing again at a future event. And Sophie paused, glancing up at Ethan, not for permission but for grounding, and he gave a small nod, not pushing, not pulling, just present. And she turned back and answered quietly, her voice still gentle but no longer uncertain. Maybe, she said, and that single word carried more strength than anyone expected. And as they continued walking, the noise behind them grew distant, replaced by the quiet rhythm of their footsteps, and Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been heavy for years finally easing, because he realized that this was not just about a song or a moment on a stage. It was about a voice reclaimed, a part of his daughter that had been hidden, now stepping into the light on her own terms. And outside, the evening air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of fading gold, and Sophie took a deep breath as they stepped into it, as if tasting the world in a new way. And Ethan looked at her, not as someone fragile who needed protection, but as someone strong who had just shown him that sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that carry the furthest. And somewhere behind them, the doors to the auditorium opened again, the sound of people still talking, still reacting, still trying to understand what they had just witnessed, and neither of them knew it yet. But that one moment, that one song, had already begun to travel far beyond that room, in ways they could not yet see. The parking lot was quieter than the hallway, the distant hum of traffic blending with the soft rustle of evening wind, and Sophie walked beside Ethan with a slower pace now, as if she was still catching up to what had just happened, her fingers brushing lightly against the seam of her dress, not out of nervousness this time, but habit. And Ethan glanced at her without turning his head fully, giving her space the way he had learned to over the years, understanding that some thoughts needed room to settle before they could be spoken. And for a while, neither of them said anything, the silence between them no longer heavy but calm, like a shared understanding that did not need to be explained. And then Sophie spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Did I do it right?" she asked, not looking at him, her eyes focused on the fading light ahead. And Ethan let out a small breath, the kind that carried both emotion and clarity. "You did not do it right," he said gently, and she turned slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. And he met her gaze fully now, a soft smile forming. "You did it honestly," he added, and something in her expression shifted, a small release, like tension she did not realize she held finally letting go. And they reached the car, the old paint catching the last bit of sunlight, and Ethan opened the door for her without thinking, a simple gesture he had done 1,000 times. But tonight it felt different, like everything was being seen in a new light. And as Sophie climbed in, she paused for a second, her hand resting on the edge of the door. "I heard Mom," she said softly, almost like she was unsure if she should say it out loud. And Ethan froze for just a moment, not from shock, but from the weight of what that meant. And he nodded slowly, his voice calm. "I think she heard you too," he replied, and Sophie sat down, closing the door gently, and the quiet inside the car wrapped around her, not empty but full, like the echo of something beautiful that had not yet faded. And Ethan walked around to the driver's side, his steps steady, his thoughts moving in a way they had not in years, because for so long he had been trying to hold the past in place, to protect what was left of it. But tonight had shown him that some things were not meant to be held still. They were meant to be carried forward, reshaped, lived again in new ways. And as he started the engine, the soft vibration filled the space, grounding them back into the present. And Sophie leaned her head lightly against the window, watching the sky shift into deeper shades of blue. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she needed to hide. And Ethan glanced at her once more before pulling out. And though the road ahead looked the same as it always had, something about it felt different, like it was leading somewhere new, somewhere they had not dared to imagine before, and neither of them said it. But they both felt it, that what had happened on that stage was not just a moment. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, something quiet, something powerful, something that was already starting to change everything. The road stretched quietly ahead under the dim glow of streetlights, each passing beam sliding across the windshield like a slow rhythm, and Sophie watched it all in silence, her reflection faint against the glass, her expression softer now, more settled, as if something inside her had finally found a place to rest, while Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind not racing, but moving gently through thoughts that no longer felt heavy, just different, like pieces rearranging themselves into something clearer. And for a few miles, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional passing car, until Sophie shifted slightly in her seat, turning just enough to face him. "I was not scared," she said quietly, almost surprised by her own words, and Ethan glanced at her briefly, a small nod forming as he understood what she meant beneath what she said. "I know," he replied, his voice calm, and she leaned back again, her fingers tracing a small invisible pattern on her knee. "I thought I would be," she continued, "but when I started it felt like I was not alone." And Ethan's grip on the wheel softened just a fraction, not from tension but from recognition, because that feeling, that sense of not being alone even in the most exposed moment, was something he had once known too, long before life had taught him how quickly it could disappear, and he let out a quiet breath. "Sometimes the things we carry with us, they show up when we need them the most," he said, choosing his words carefully. And Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to the window, where the dark outline of trees moved past like silent witnesses, and the night air outside seemed to hold a kind of calm that mirrored what she felt inside. And as they drove, the memory of the auditorium did not fade. It settled, becoming something less sharp and more meaningful, like a story already beginning to take shape. And Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he was not replaying what he should have done differently. He was simply holding on to what had happened, exactly as it was. And that in itself felt like a kind of freedom. And Sophie suddenly sat up a little straighter, as if a thought had just found her. "Do you think they heard it?" she asked, her voice careful, not referring to the audience but to something deeper, something unspoken. And Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes staying on the road as he let the question settle, because some answers needed to be felt before they could be spoken. And then he nodded once, slowly. "Yes," he said, "I think they did." And Sophie did not ask anything else. She just let that answer stay with her, her shoulders relaxing again, and the car continued forward, steady and quiet, carrying them through a night that felt a little less dark than before. And somewhere behind them, far beyond the school, beyond the room filled with applause and silence, something had already begun to move, something they could not see yet, a ripple that started with a single note and was now finding its way into places neither of them had imagined. And as the headlights cut through the road ahead, it became clear in the quietest way possible that this was not the end of what had started, it was only the beginning of how far that one moment could travel. The car rolled into the driveway with a soft crunch of gravel, the headlights briefly illuminating the front of the small house before fading into darkness. And Sophie did not move right away, her hand resting lightly against the door handle as if she was not quite ready to step out of the moment they had been carrying with them, while Ethan turned off the engine and sat in the quiet that followed. The kind of quiet that no longer felt empty, but full of something steady and grounding. And after a few seconds, Sophie opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air brushing against her face, and she took a deeper breath than usual, like she was testing something new inside herself, something that had not been there before. And Ethan followed, locking the car with a soft click, his eyes lifting briefly to the sky where a few stars had begun to appear, faint but present, and together they walked toward the front door, their steps in rhythm without trying. And when they stepped inside, the house greeted them with its familiar stillness, the soft creak of the wooden floor, the faint scent of old books, and something warm that lingered from earlier in the day. And Sophie paused near the doorway to the living room, her eyes drifting toward the corner where the piano stood, untouched for so long that it had become more memory than object. And Ethan noticed it immediately, the way her gaze settled there, not with fear, but with something quieter, something closer to curiosity. And he did not say anything. He did not need to, because this moment belonged to her. And slowly, almost carefully, Sophie walked toward the piano, her steps light but deliberate, and she reached out, her fingers hovering just above the keys for a brief second before pressing down gently. And the sound that followed was soft, slightly imperfect, but alive, and she did not pull her hand away this time. She pressed another key, then another, building a simple pattern that echoed faintly through the room. And Ethan stood a few feet away, watching, not interrupting, not guiding, just witnessing, because he understood now that this was not about teaching or correcting. This was about letting something return in its own way. And Sophie paused for a moment, her fingers resting on the keys, and then she played that same note again, the one from the stage, the one that had changed everything. And this time, it sounded different, not because the note itself had changed, but because she had. And Ethan felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest, something steady and real, as he realized that what had begun in that crowded auditorium was continuing here, in the simplest, most honest space they had. And Sophie turned her head slightly, not fully looking at him, but aware of his presence. And she smiled, small but certain, and for the first time in a long time, the house did not feel like a place holding on to the past. It felt like a place where something new was beginning to grow, one note at a time, and neither of them said it out loud. But they both understood that whatever had started tonight was not meant to stay in one moment. It was meant to keep moving, to keep unfolding, in ways they were only just starting to discover. The house remained quiet except for the soft echo of piano keys, each note finding its place in the air like it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. And Sophie did not rush. She pressed each key with care, listening closely as if the sound itself was guiding her forward, while Ethan leaned lightly against the wall, arms relaxed, his presence steady but unobtrusive. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the urge to step in, to correct, or to protect, because he could see clearly now that what she was doing did not need interference, it needed space. And Sophie paused, her fingers resting gently on the keys, her eyes lowering as if she was searching inside herself for what came next. And then she began again, this time not just repeating what she remembered, but shaping something new, something her own, the melody shifting slightly, imperfect in structure but rich in feeling. And Ethan noticed it immediately, the difference, the quiet confidence growing beneath the surface, and he felt a deep sense of respect settle in his chest, not just for the sound she was creating, but for the courage it took to create it at all. And the room seemed to hold that courage, the walls that once carried silence now carrying something alive, something moving. And Sophie let out a small breath as she finished the phrase, her shoulders relaxing as if she had crossed an invisible line. And she looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes fully this time, not seeking approval but sharing the moment. And he gave a small nod, not exaggerated, just enough to let her know he was there, that he understood. And she smiled again, a little wider now, the kind of smile that does not ask for permission. And as she stood from the piano bench, the sound of the last note lingered in the room, soft but present. And for a second, neither of them spoke, because they both felt it, the shift, the quiet transformation that had started earlier now taking deeper root. And then Sophie moved toward the kitchen, her steps light, almost absent-minded, as if her body was catching up to where her heart had already gone. And Ethan followed slowly, watching her with a calm that felt new, because the weight he had carried for so long, the worry, the constant need to anticipate what might hurt her, was no longer controlling him. It was easing, replaced by something stronger, trust. And as they moved through the familiar space, Sophie reached for a glass of water, her movements simple and natural, and she took a sip before speaking, her voice quiet but clear. "It did not hurt this time," she said, and Ethan understood immediately what she meant. Not just the singing, but everything that had come with it before, the fear, the memories, the silence, and he nodded slowly. "That is how you know it is yours now," he replied. And Sophie considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if accepting something she had not been ready to accept before. And outside, the night deepened, the world continuing as it always did, unaware of the quiet change happening inside that small house. But within those walls, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, something steady and real, something that would not disappear when the moment passed. And as Ethan turned off the kitchen light and the house settled into a softer darkness, it became clear that what had begun as a single note was no longer just a moment in time. It was becoming part of who she was, something that would follow her forward, quietly, steadily, into whatever came next. The night settled gently over the house, wrapping it in a quiet stillness that felt different from the nights before, and Sophie moved through her evening routine with a calm that was new. Brushing her hair slowly in front of the mirror, her reflection no longer distant or guarded but present, as if she was seeing herself more clearly for the first time in a long while. While Ethan stood just outside her doorway for a moment, watching without interrupting, his posture relaxed, his expression thoughtful, because something had changed not only in her but in him as well, and he could feel it in the way the air moved, in the way the silence no longer carried tension, only peace. And Sophie set the brush down and turned slightly, noticing him there, and she gave a small nod, not questioning, just acknowledging, and he returned it with the same quiet understanding. And as she climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders, there was no hesitation, no lingering unease, only a soft exhale as she settled in, and Ethan stepped into the room just enough to turn off the lamp, the warm light fading into a gentle darkness. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. And then Sophie's voice came softly. "It feels different," she said, her words simple but carrying weight, and Ethan paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "What does?" he asked, not assuming, not rushing, and she took a small breath, her eyes looking toward the ceiling as if searching for the right way to say it. "Everything," she replied, and Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than the word itself, understanding the shift that had taken place beneath it, and he stepped back slightly, giving her space. "That means you are growing into it," he said quietly, and Sophie did not answer right away, but her breathing steadied, her body relaxing further into the bed, and after a few seconds, she closed her eyes, not from exhaustion but from peace. And Ethan watched for just a moment longer before gently closing the door, leaving it slightly open the way he always did. And as he walked down the hallway, the soft creak of the floor beneath his steps felt familiar, but the weight in his chest did not return. It remained light, steady, as if something long held had finally been set down, and he paused near the living room, his gaze drifting once more to the piano, the same piano that had stood silent for years now, holding the echo of new sound. And he stepped closer, resting his hand lightly against its surface, not playing, not revisiting the past, just acknowledging what had come back to life. And in that quiet moment, he allowed himself to feel it fully, not the loss, not the regret, but the continuation, the way something meaningful could be carried forward in a different form. And he let out a slow breath, one that seemed to release years of tension he had not even realized he was holding. And outside, the night remained still, the world moving quietly beyond their walls, unaware of the small but profound shift that had taken place inside. And as Ethan turned off the last light and the house settled completely into darkness, there was no sense of ending, only a calm awareness that what had begun would continue, quietly, steadily, shaping the days ahead in ways neither of them needed to rush to understand. The morning arrived quietly, the first light slipping through the curtains in soft, pale lines that stretched across the floor, and Sophie woke without the usual heaviness, her eyes opening slowly as if she was stepping into the day instead of bracing for it. And for a moment, she simply lay there, listening, the house calm, the air still, and then she sat up, not with hesitation but with a quiet sense of purpose, her feet touching the floor with a steadiness that had not been there before. While down the hall, Ethan was already awake, standing by the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunlight catch on the edge of the window, his thoughts not crowded but clear. And when he heard Sophie's door open, he did not turn immediately, giving her space to enter the day in her own way. And she walked into the kitchen a few seconds later, her steps soft but certain, her eyes meeting his briefly before she reached for a glass. The simple familiarity of the moment grounding them both, and neither of them rushed to speak, because there was no need to fill the quiet. It was already full, and after a few moments, Sophie looked toward the living room, her gaze settling once again on the piano, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation. She walked toward it naturally, like it had always belonged to her, and Ethan watched from the doorway, not stepping closer, not interrupting, just present. And Sophie sat down, her hands resting on the keys for a brief second before she began to play, the notes soft but deliberate, not searching, not uncertain, but chosen, and the melody that formed was not the same as the night before. It carried something new, something shaped by what she had felt, what she had understood, and the sound moved through the house with a quiet confidence, filling the space in a way that felt both gentle and strong. And Ethan felt a small smile form, not out of surprise but recognition, because this was no longer about finding her voice. It was about using it. And Sophie continued, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, and when she finished, she did not look back right away. She simply let the final note settle, allowing the silence to follow it naturally. And then she turned, her expression calm, and Ethan met her gaze with a quiet nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. And in that moment, there was no need to talk about what had happened, no need to explain it, because they both understood that something had shifted, something that would not go back to the way it was before. And outside, the day continued to unfold, cars passing, people moving, the world unaware of the quiet transformation inside that small house. But within those walls, something steady had taken root, something that would continue to grow, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, meaningful ways. And as Sophie stood from the piano and moved toward the table, the rhythm of the day beginning to take shape around her, it became clear that what had started as a single moment on a stage had become something much more, something lasting, something that would follow her forward, quietly shaping every step she took from here on. The day moved forward with a quiet rhythm, the kind that does not demand attention but slowly reshapes everything within it. And Sophie stepped outside later that morning with a calm steadiness, the sunlight resting gently on her shoulders, no longer something she avoided, but something she stood in. And as she walked toward the edge of the yard, there was no hesitation in her steps, no second-guessing, only a quiet awareness of herself in the world, while Ethan watched from the doorway, not holding on, not stepping in, simply present in a way that honored who she was becoming. And the memory of the auditorium, the laughter, the silence, the single note that changed everything, no longer felt like a sharp moment frozen in time. It had softened, becoming part of something larger, something that continued to unfold with each step she took. And Sophie paused for a moment, looking out at the open street, the ordinary world carrying on, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place. And yet she did not need the world to notice, because something inside her had already shifted, something steady and true. And she took a slow breath, the air filling her lungs without resistance, without fear. And in that breath was a kind of clarity that had been missing before, a sense that her voice, her presence, her place in the world did not need permission to exist. And back inside, Ethan moved through the house with a lighter step, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because he no longer carried it the same way. The weight of protecting, of fearing, of anticipating what might break had given way to something quieter, something stronger, trust. And as he passed the piano, he paused briefly, not to touch it this time, but to simply acknowledge it, The way one acknowledges something that has returned not as it once was, but as something new, something living. And the silence in the house was no longer absence. It was space. Space for growth, for sound, for whatever would come next. And outside, Sophie turned back toward the house, her eyes meeting Ethan's through the open doorway. And in that glance, there was no question, no doubt, only a shared understanding that what had begun was not meant to end in applause or recognition. It was meant to continue, quietly, steadily, shaping who she would become. And Ethan gave a small nod, not as approval, not as direction, but as recognition, and Sophie returned it with a calm confidence that needed nothing more. And as the day carried on, the world moved as it always did. But within that small space, something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Something rooted in quiet dignity, in grace, in the simple but powerful truth that a single honest moment can shift everything. And though no one outside that room, that house, that moment could fully see it, the echo of that one note would continue, not loudly, not all at once, but in every step forward, in every breath taken without fear, in every choice to be heard without needing to be the loudest, and in the quietest way possible. The world had not just listened. It had been reminded that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that does not need to fight to be heard. It only needs the courage to begin.